I'm Myrna McCallum, Métis Cree lawyer and passionate promoter of trauma-informed lawyering. Welcome to my new podcast, The Trauma-Informed Lawyer. I believe that law schools and bar courses are missing a critical competency requirement in their curriculum, trauma-informed lawyering. Becoming a trauma-informed lawyer will, among other things, challenge you to critically reflect on your personal behaviors, beliefs, and biases, call on you to positively transform the way you approach advocacy, guide your practice to avoid doing further harm to others, and ask that you commit to remaining open to learn new and old knowledge you didn't know you needed before beginning your career. Your education starts right here, right now. This podcast comes to you from the traditional, unceded territories of the Squamish, Slate, and Musqueam people. Welcome back, everyone, to the Trauma-Informed Lawyer podcast. I'm going to be talking about the Indigenous experience within the courts and with lawyers generally. It's kind of a heavy topic. I also want to say, before we get into it, thank you so much for coming back and for listening and for supporting the work that I'm doing. I've received several messages from various listeners, and it just blows me away. It humbles me. So thank you so much for your feedback and for your support. And I also want to say welcome to my listeners or subscribers in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, as well as the Netherlands. It totally blows my mind that people are listening to me in those parts of the world. So thank you for subscribing. And I'd say today's conversation would mirror some of the history of the Maori and the Aborigines in New Zealand and Australia. I mean, what we have in common as Indigenous people or the original peoples of these lands is that we've all experienced colonization, the effects of which are very similar. First, I want to say that I'm incredibly grateful to all of the Indigenous people that I've encountered, whether it was in the courtroom as a prosecutor or in a hearing room as an adjudicator. It's really Indigenous people who have taught me how to become a trauma-informed lawyer. They taught me the importance of cultural humility and understanding why my approach and my perspective needed to change, and how deciding to hold true to maybe what I was taught in law school was doing more harm than good. And so to them, I raise my hands because I'm incredibly and profoundly grateful. I want to begin by just saying that I have encountered many lawyers who have done really good and profoundly positive work with Indigenous people. And to them, I really appreciate the work that you've done and the approach and the heart that you bring to advocacy. For I've also observed some lawyers who have not done good work with Indigenous people, who've walked into a community hall to talk about the Indian Day School process in a way where they brought their, to quote Gabor, their fancy articulation and an air of superiority with them. Clearly no self-awareness, no understanding of who their audience is, no willingness to read the room, so to speak. And I just thought, what a profound disservice this lawyer is doing to these people sitting here, these elders who don't even understand what he is saying and cannot connect it to their lived experience. And it's really in observing him and having observed others who brought a similar approach to their engagement with Indigenous people that really got me thinking that lawyers and judges who work in largely Indigenous communities or work in the area of Indigenous rights or intend to work with Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, you're going to see a lot of Indigenous people in the courts. This episode really is for you. There's some things you really need to know. There are some changes that you need to make. And so let me just offer up my perspective, my understanding, and my own lived experience to help guide you in a better direction So what you need to know first and foremost is when Indigenous people show up within systems and they appear quite resistant or suspicious or angry, well, the root of that is fear. And they have fear for good reason. Lawyers, the courts, the police, those are all agents of oppression, really. I mean, if you look at the history of Indigenous people in terms of how they were treated by the courts or how they were treated by police, even lawyers, they have good reason to be afraid. Usually when those players show up, it means a loss for them. So it's a loss of land, a loss of home, a loss of community, a loss of freedom, a loss of children. That is the real reality, the real lived experience of Indigenous people, not just historically, but today. So if you're going to work with Indigenous people or in Indigenous communities, get an education in the history of Indigenous people, particularly those Indigenous people on whose territory you are living and working. You need to read about the Indian Act and how it has imposed so many restrictions on the lives of status Indians across this country, how it has confined us to reserves and even prohibited us from being able to become lawyers or obtain legal counsel up until 1951. Read the Indian Act. Understand how we were held back. Find out about what residential schools operated in the area or territory that you live and work in. Find out how Indigenous people are facing the challenges that they face individually and collectively. How are they overcoming? How are they thriving? How are they fighting? Understand what their history has been, what their relationships have been with these authorities, what the relationship is today, how it got that way, how they're healing and resisting and overcoming. Because, Indigenous people, we're not victims. We're not mere survivors. We're also overcomers and we're thrivers and we're healing. Have a really broad look at how we were taken down and how we are rising. I think most people know that Indian residential schools were profoundly destructive when it came to Indigenous people, cultures, and communities. Did you know that the last residential school closed in my home province of Saskatchewan in 1996? I went to residential school. My brother, who's 4 years younger than me, went to residential school. You're going to encounter people who went to residential school and have experienced direct traumas and intergenerational because these schools existed for so long. So residential schools have impacted Indigenous people and communities in so many ways. And if you haven't yet made the connection between the impacts and that lived experience, let me try to help you a little bit. The government, the churches, and the RCMP work together to kidnap Indigenous children from their communities. Now, most Indigenous people, their cultures, their kinship ties, their traditions, everything is so tightly interconnected to parenting and relationship and having a role as a grandparent, a parent, a child. When that's disrupted and disconnected, what do you think is going to happen? Suddenly, your community that is thriving with children and grandparents who are teaching and healing and guiding, suddenly there's no more children. So who's to teach, who's to love, who's to guide? And can you imagine the hole that leaves in the hearts of those grandparents and those parents when there's no one left to love? And imagine what happens to those children when they're now in a foreign environment and they are not safe. They're subject to unspeakable cruelties and they don't understand what is happening to them and why their parents and their grandparents are not there for them. I mean, the damage that causes has had quite the ripple effect, and we feel it today. We see it today. So, in the child welfare system, you see parents, Indigenous parents, struggling to parent. Why? Because they never had one. In the educational system, you see Indigenous people sometimes having an inability to problem solve. There's a direct connection to residential schools there. Another example is addictions and self-harm. That's an inability to cope with emotional and mental disturbance. Intimate partner violence, an inability to form healthy relationships. In the criminal justice system, there's an inability to make good decisions that is seen all the time. And then, of course, an inability to love, which fuels it all while generating crisis and chaos. Those are just some of the effects that I've observed. I mean, there's so many out there. I raise those things as examples so that when you are seeing Indigenous people embroiled and trapped in the criminal justice system and you're thinking, man, why can't these people just stop offending or stop drinking or stop giving up their kids or stop dropping out of school or stop killing themselves? Maybe what you actually need to be asking is, what happened to them that brought them to this point? I mean, that question echoes what Gabor said in an earlier episode. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And I think that as justice participants, you all need to ask that question when you're encountering people who are entrapped in these systems. What happened to you? And the answer you might receive could change your entire world. When I deliver training to folks, I always have to talk about Justice Langston and sentencing decision of his. Justice Langston was a Alberta Court of Queen's Bench judge. He's retired. I think he retired in 2018. But he said something in sentencing Barbara Holmes for manslaughter that I'd never heard a judge say. Honestly, the first time I read his words, I cried. If more judges would state the same obvious historical events that have led Indigenous people to the courtrooms that they find themselves in today, the whole justice system would have to transform itself. Relationships between judges, lawyers, police, and Indigenous people would have to change. So I'm just going to quote a little bit of what he said. He said, "This is an Aboriginal offender. She's in a system which is imposed upon Aboriginal people, and I use that word deliberately. Our history in relation to Aboriginal people is one of deliberate destruction. We have systematically destroyed their culture, their way of living. We have done everything we can to take from them their sense of spirituality and identity. I'm not saying anything new. You can look in the volumes of reports and studies that have been done on Aboriginal people for decades. Those reports sit gathering dust in libraries and parliament buildings." He goes on to say, "Aboriginal people are entitled to a sense of dignity when they come into our courts. They are entitled to a recognition of their history and their culture. You can't talk about those two things without a notional recognition of their spirituality." He adds, "There is a fundamental disconnect between the Aboriginal view of justice and the system I am a part of." So in case any members of the RCMP or Brenda Lucky herself are listening, I think that in a nutshell captures what systemic racism is, how it looks, how it plays out. Deliberate destruction. That has been the Indigenous experience at the hands of the police and the courts, and sometimes at the hands of lawyers themselves who are supposed to be advocating and helping Indigenous people. There's so much I can say about Justice Langston's words, but I'm just going to leave it there for you to sit with and think about. Think about how his words are really a call to action for judges and for courts all across this country to do better, to be better, to transform it, to look at how they are complicit in upholding a racist system that, in the words of Ivan Zinger of Corrections Canada, has led to the indigenization of Canadian prisons. How have you played a part in that? What system do you uphold? There are things you need to think about. We all need to think about. I think about these things. I'm an Indigenous lawyer. I think about this all the time. What am I upholding? Why am I upholding systems that I don't necessarily believe in? So I would also say that Justice Langston's observations and truth-telling and call to action is also a very clear demonstration of a man who has developed cultural humility. I know that language is probably pretty foreign for some. And I'm going to do my best to help define it and distinguish it for you from cultural competence. As I've come to understand it, cultural competence is really about promoting this idea that we can become experts in the cultures of other people, which I kind of think that's so whack and offensive. Like, really? I'm going to be an expert in your culture? I don't think so. Cultural humility, however, is a recognition that you can never be the expert in someone else's culture, that in fact, they are the experts in their culture, and you will always be the student. You will always be learning. The learning never ends. It's a lifelong process. And how do you develop cultural humility? Through listening, through building partnerships with Indigenous communities, nations, leadership, by walking into a community with the understanding that you are there to learn. Cultural humility requires a willingness to openly talk about cultural differences, misunderstandings, a history of deliberate destruction. You can't get over something. You can't transform something without identifying it first. Name it, confront it, and then transform it. Cultural humility is going to challenge you to confront your biases, to reflect on what you think you know and what the source of your knowledge is about Indigenous people. It's also going to call on you to change the way you ask questions, to ask open-ended questions, to thoughtfully listen, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's critical to recognize and respect the unique histories of Indigenous people and the traumas that they have experienced at the hands of the state, the church, and the police. And yeah, by extension, the courts. You want to avoid re-traumatizing and re-victimizing Indigenous people. The pathway to doing that is cultural humility. I like to say, if trauma-informed practice is the left hand, cultural humility is the right hand. Those things go together. What is my call to action for you? Know your client. Earn their trust. Leave your sense of entitlement behind. Acknowledge your privilege. Be humble when you walk into a room. Practice humility. Remember in an earlier episode, I talked about self-awareness? Well, become self-aware. It's really simple. The things that you can do to transform the way you engage with Indigenous people, the way you come onto their territories and into their communities. Leave behind any sense of superiority. Adopt a practice of humility. Be prepared to learn. Be prepared to be uncomfortable. Be prepared to be patient. Be prepared to be silent. Leave behind your fancy articulation and along with it, your fancy suit and your fancy bag. I also want to just comment on Gladue report writers. You know, my hands go up to Gladue report writers across this country. I know the kinds of traumatic stories that you are hearing as you are compiling these reports for the courts. I know the pain and the sorrow and the fear and the anger that you are exposing yourself to as a result of getting as much information about offender as possible. And I just want to say thank you all for doing the work that you're doing. It takes tremendous courage and bravery to be able to confront the lived experiences of Indigenous people who are in the courts, because it's all pain, it's all shame, it's all hardship, it's sorrow and sexual abuse and abandonment and drug abuse and addictions of all sorts. So I hope that you are all taking care of yourself as you do the work that you're doing so that you can continue to do this work for the long haul. There is so much more that I would like to share about how to work with Indigenous people that recognizes and accommodates and respects trauma. Unfortunately, we're running out of time today. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to know what you think. You know, you can find me at Legal Trauma on Twitter, as well as the Trauma Informed Lawyer on Instagram. Of course, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Next time I come back, I'm going to have an interview to share with you that I did with Chris Howarth, who is a former police officer in the UK who is delivering quite a bit of training to police on trauma-informed policing. And I thought this is such an opportune, excellent time to talk about policing, but more importantly, trauma-informed policing and the difference that that makes, not just to the public, but to the police force themselves. And so I hope that you will come back and listen to that interview. It was quite informative. Today, I'm going to just leave you with a recording by Leonard Sumner. He recorded a piece called I Know You're Sorry, and I think everybody should listen to this Anishinaabe artist. His words are profound. I hope you enjoy.
The government of Canada sincerely apologizes and forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
All is not forgotten, and someone is forgiven. Words that say to soften up the hardness that I'm living in. I hate to say indifference is becoming my religion, but I haven't learned to pray in ways to satisfy tradition. When I think about identity, I think about my language, how my folks were taught it would be to my advantage. To learn a foreign tongue, they could not foresee the damage. Damn shame when it happens, you don't see it till it passes. So where's all the support for Anishinaabe Moan classes? Assimilation tactics left no room for us to practice, and I really wish I could adjust. Yeah, I really wish I could have just listen with my heart and not my ego. I was fragile, conditioned by the world to think my culture wasn't passed down, but I learned the generosity. It's in my genealogy, so fuck all the bureaucracy and keep all your apologies. I know you're sorry, but you're more lost than me. Your land's across the ocean and I'm right where I should be. And I reckon this damn nation will force reconciliation down the throats of our survivors and the people it's displacing. I know you're sorry, and now you call on me to fix the broken hearts created by your policies. And these are the things that I think I know. I am but a leaf on a tree that grows its roots in the ground like a seed that's sown in the dirt of the earth is where I was born. It's where I will return when this journey ends and I've earned what I've learned. So tell me to get over it. I'm so fucking over it. Steal everything in sight and teach me about private ownership. Bleach everything you like and teach me about pride of ownership. Bleach my inherent rights and tell me that I never owned this shit. As generations pass, you'll act as if you never noticed it. While there's kids committing suicide as a way out of the hopelessness, I know you're sorry. You say you're not to blame. Fill your heart to brim with guilt, but not announce a shame. Break branches off of family trees and tell us times have changed, but the focus of this genocide at root remains intact. So instead of killing Indian kids, why don't we kill this Indian act?